All right, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is the Korean War, and we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know as you go to read more about this topic and to learn more about the war, about Korea, and about the Korean people. Because in all of this, we need to make sure that we don't singularly think of the Korean War through the lens of the Cold War, that we need to see this as both an external struggle, but also an internal one for the soul of Korea amongst the Korean people themselves. First off, it's not MASH. Okay? Remember, Hollywood's great. Hollywood tells us a good story. If anything, Hollywood can be a gateway for us to go learn about things. MASH was an incredibly popular TV show in America and all over the world in the 1970s and the early 80s. It was a show supposedly based on a mobile army surgical hospital in Korea during the Korean War. And it was a fun show. It was a compelling show. It had great comedy and it had great drama. But most of America, and you can say the writers probably of the show as well, aren't really writing about the Korean War when they're constructing that show or thinking about that show or watching that show or processing that show. It's far more a projection of commentary about what America had lived through in the 1960s and early 70s in conflicts like Vietnam. Something like over 100 million people saw the last episode of MASH. So again, its power, it's cementing into America's long cultural conversation matters. And we need to make sure that we understand that it's not an accurate reflection of the Korean War. Secondly, colonialism. Beginning with the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Japan will come to take over Korea, colonize it, and govern it through the end of the Second World War. It will engage in a systematic process of extracting resources from Korea, of brutalizing the Korean people, particularly women, throughout the duration of this time. A term for us to know with that is something called comfort women, where sadly many thousands of young Korean women and girls were abducted and taken and forced into a status of sexual slavery to serve in brothels and state-sanctioned brothels on behalf or for the Japanese military. Thirdly, Incheon. The Korean War began in 1950. There was a back and forth political process between the end of World War II and 1950, but the war began in 1950. When the Americans will go to the United Nations and work with the UN to coordinate a counterattack to push North Korean forces back up across the parallel, they will do so with a landing at Incheon. Now, this is attacking those North Korean forces essentially from behind, and it would be a very, very, very successful attack undertaken by forces led by the American Commander General Douglas MacArthur. Now, MacArthur has his own issues. He is someone who certainly fell prey to the racial predilections of his day, so he has a troubled legacy, perhaps at best. But from an operational standpoint, Incheon was a very successful military operation. Fourth, UN forces. Now, the American military has a sizable presence in Korea between 1950 and 1953, and the footprint of America's presence in Korea is still there to this day. But we need to acknowledge the presence of UN forces from across the UN, from across the world, that took part in the war between 1950 and 1953. The British perhaps provided one of the largest contingents of these troops, but again, these troops that fought in Korea were from all over the world, and it's important to acknowledge that. Fifth, the 1953 agreement. The agreement in 1953 doesn't completely end the Korean War. All right? It doesn't officially end the war. There is a ceasefire, essentially, and there is still, of course, to this day, a tenuous situation at the border between North and South Korea. I've been to the DMZ myself on the American and South Korean side. That's a place unlike any other in the world. But the 1953 agreement brings the bulk of the conflict to a close, but it doesn't officially end the war. All right. Thank you very much.